This year, Afghanistan surpassed Vietnam as the longest military engagement in American history. It was also the bloodiest year on record in the 9-year war. In great detail, a release of WikiLeaks cables a few months back clearly illuminated the brutality in the conflict in Afghanistan for Americans. And a strategy review released by President Obama stated the U.S. military will likely be involved in that country for at least another 4 years. On top of that, the war costs us, taxpayers, more than $160 billion each year. But in a year that deficit reduction is a hot-button issue, the cost of the war has hardly been talked about. In fact, despite all the big news surrounding Afghanistan, it seems like there's been little attention focused on it at all. Why? Shouldn't thousands of dead U.S. soldiers and hundreds of billions of dollars be a big news item? Well, the Pew Research Center devoted a study to this very same issue that shed some light on this prevalent apathy among Americans to the Afghanistan war. And what they found was shocking. The American news media has devoted only 4% of its coverage this year to the Afghanistan war. Only 4%. The media claims they don't cover the war because it doesn't interest people. Isn't that a problem? Aren't news outlets supposed to be reporting on what we need to know rather than what we want to know? Or is there another reason why our news media has decided to pass on coverage of Afghanistan? Here to answer that question is a man who knows a lot about both the media and war, Chris Hedges, columnist at Truth Out, senior fellow at the Nation Institute in New York, also the author of numerous books, his latest, Death of the Liberal Class. Chris, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Tom.
Chris, you wrote a book called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning that is, frankly, both powerful and in many ways kind of horrifying. Is that, and the title I think is relatively self-explanatory, is that part of what we're seeing here in Afghanistan?
Yes and no. I think what's happened in Afghanistan is that the war, like the war in Iraq, has been shunted so far to the margins of American society that most people can go about their daily lives as if those wars didn't exist. When I write about the effects of war, I write about the effects for the combatants, but also the kind of myth of war that is perpetuated at home. I would say with these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that have lost their any kind of popular appeal, and they had a popular appeal at the initial stages of the war, we've essentially, we live as if they don't exist. And of course, the media, as you just pointed out, has decided to collaborate in this in the kind of vanishing conflicts that are at best only intermittently glimpsed by the American people.
According to globalsecurity.org, General Electric's defense business in 2004 was $1.822 billion, $1,822 million, larger than Carlyle, Bechtel, IT&T, and Honeywell. And they own NBC. Other networks have interlocking boards with defense contractors or relationships with them, if at the very least millions of dollars in advertising. Is that a piece of this?
Well, I think more importantly what's happened is that with the consolidation of the news media into roughly about 6 corporate entities, Viacom, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, General Electric, as you point out, Disney, the only thing they care about is profit. And it's extremely expensive to cover war. And so they don't do it. They provide the kind of tawdry, salacious celebrity gossip and, personal sagas of John Edwards' love child or whatever it is that is currently happening as a way to sort of divert attention from issues that any serious journalist would cover.
But, I get it that they've been closing foreign bureaus all around the world, that it's more expensive to cover, from Afghanistan, to get the translators in, to get the camera crews and everything like that. But, I mean, there has been such an abundance of information coming out of Afghanistan. Just the stuff in WikiLeaks, for example, that's not getting reported on. How do we account for that? Is that first point that you made well, in fact, let me frame it slightly differently. Would the entire gestalt of this be different if we had a draft?
Of course it would, which is why we don't have a draft, and it's why we have mercenary forces, in essence, fighting these wars. There are more mercenary forces at this point in Afghanistan than there are regular military troops and soldiers. So, and that is because the only way, and these corporations, and let's remember that many of the corporations, including the same corporations that control the media, are making a great deal of money. For them, this war, both the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, are a very, very, very good business. So they don't really care how disastrous it is, and we're clearly losing the war in Afghanistan. We've replicated the disastrous 10-year occupation of the Red Army, where we sort of control these amorphous urban areas where about 20% of Afghans live, and the rest of the country is either in the hands of the Taliban or in dispute. But that doesn't matter if you're Raytheon, if you're Halliburton, if you're Northrop Grumman, if you're Dicor, if you're Blackwater, now renamed Z. The profits keep rolling in, and so the consolidation of the media into corporate hands means that there is a twinning of interests that is very frightening, and I think we're seeing that.
How, Chris Hedges, in your opinion, do we bring ourselves back from this edge?
We have to shatter the death grip that the corporate state has on the country. It's hollowing the country out from the inside. It's a supranational force. Remember, companies like Halliburton, which are parasitic, they make their money by sucking the marrow out of U.S. taxpayers and the U.S. government, then move all their subsidiaries over to Dubai so that they don't have to pay taxes. Unfortunately, we have undergone a kind of coup d'etat in slow motion, and they've won and we've lost. So that as bad as the war is, and as disastrous as especially the war in Afghanistan has become, corporate profit trumps everything, including, finally, national security.
Chris, last week you were arrested along with about 100 other people, Daniel Ellsberg among them, in front of the White House. In the minute and a half or so we have left, do you want to give us just a quick snapshot of what happened and your thoughts about how that might help bring about this shattering of the myth that you're talking about? I'm assuming that that was part of your motivation. Yes,
because the normal mechanisms, the structures within formal centers of power don't work. We have a Democratic Party, we have liberal institutions, including the press, which we've talked about, that are completely craven in their service to the corporate state. And unless we physically resist, then there is no hope. The systems of power, and especially the Democratic Party, are not going to save us from these forces. All we have left to ourselves, which is why I and 131 other people, including Daniel Ellsberg and others, chained ourselves to the White House fence after an anti-war rally until we were arrested.
It seemed to me that there was a news blackout on that event. Did I get that wrong? I didn't see it in any of the mainstream corporate media.
It didn't get covered.
Excuse me.
I mean, this is just a kind of withering away of the journalistic establishment. It's very depressing. When I began 25, 30 years ago, the landscape, and I'm talking about the commercial media, the for-profit media, was very, very different. And we have, it's just become abysmal. It's descended into a state of utter anemia, and in the case of most commercial electronic broadcasts, descended into kind of tawdry garbage that has nothing to do with journalism. And the idea that Katie Couric is a journalist is repugnant.
Yeah, it's gone from news to infotainment. Chris Hedges, thank you so much for being with us and for your courageous stands on these issues.
Thanks, Tom.
And your brilliant writing. The news would rather focus on stories about partisan politics or the royal wedding or bed bugs, but ending this war is one of the greatest challenges facing all of us right now. Unfortunately, Americans can't take a stand against the war if the corporations who own our news media and have interlocking boards of directors or company divisions in the defense industry won't cover it. So what do we do? How do we wake people up? Here's a really simple frame that I'd like you to share with everybody you know. Just consider this. Before we invaded Afghanistan, which at the time was, depending on whose statistics you were looking at, the second or third poorest country in the world, they had an annual gross domestic product of $2 billion. $2 billion a year ran the entire country. There was probably about another billion in an underground economy that had to do with opium. But that, you know, $2 to $3 billion. We are now spending, and by 2004 it was up to $4 billion, and that was in part because we were already starting to go in. We had already gone into Afghanistan after the bombing, and we're starting to build military infrastructure. So we have become their economy. But keep in mind, a $2 billion economy. We airlifted cash in. We ended the Taliban ban on opium growing. Yes, they had banned it. They had cut the opium crop down to about 10% of what it had been before because George W. Bush in 2001 gave them $40 million to do it. Now we're spending $160 billion a year in Afghanistan. We're spending $160 billion to occupy a country that has a GDP of $2 billion in the absence of any military presence. Think about that for a minute. If instead of bombing people, instead of killing, oh, and by the way, their militia, their military, this military that we're taking on with this $160 billion, it has no airplanes. We've got jets and helicopters. They have no tanks or armored vehicles. They have no drones or satellites. Their highest technology is cell phones, which we can monitor, by the way. You know, George Washington took on the world's mightiest army and navy. Afghans see themselves as repelling an occupier. They're thinking of themselves as if they were George Washington. They're not going to give up. We've seen this in the Soviet example and others. This President Obama needs to take the advice that George Aiken, the Republican senator from Vermont, gave to LBJ during Vietnam. Declare victory and come home.